Let me tell you about an old man who bought 40 acres of dead rock on a south-facing hillside in the high desert of southeastern Arizona, and what I watched him do with it from my side of the fence over the 7 years that followed. My name is not the important part of this telling. What matters is that my ranch sat on the bench of ground just north of his, close enough that from my kitchen window I could see the whole face of that bald, stony slope, and far enough that for a long while I could not make sense of a single thing he was doing up there. The morning he drove the first stake into that ground, I was standing at the corner of my horse corral with a tin cup of coffee in my hand, watching the sun come up over the Chiricahua Rim. It was the third week of October, 1985, a Wednesday, the kind of dry cold the high desert gives you in the fall, where the air bites the back of your throat at dawn, but the light has already gone warm and gold by 7 in the morning. He was up there on the slope with what looked from a quarter-mile off like a length of iron bar with a wooden handle, driving holes into ground that had not grown anything but lechuguilla, and a little ocotillo for as far back as anyone in the valley could remember. That hillside had a name, and the name was not kind. Folks around there called it the Burn Rock, though nothing had burned on it in living memory. It was just dead. 40 acres of thin caliche soil over a shelf of pale limestone, south-facing, exposed to the full sun all day long, so dry and stony that even the cattle would not climb it. 2 ranchers had tried to run stock across it in years past, and both gave up because the animals lost weight walking it for nothing. The man who owned it before had let it go for back taxes, and the county had sold it at auction in late August that year for less than the price of a good used truck. Nobody bid against the old man. The whole tent had laughed when he raised his hand. His name, I would learn, was Earl Lindquist. He was 63 years old that fall, lean and sun-darkened, with a face full of deep lines and a head of gray blonde hair gone mostly white. He had spent 40 years running a small cattle operation up near Wilcox that his father had started, and he had lost the last of it 2 years before when the drought and the bank took it between them. His wife had passed the winter before that. He had walked away with a paid-off pickup, a little money, and whatever a man carries inside him that the bank cannot reach. And now he had spent a piece of that money on the one parcel in the valley that everybody knew for a certainty was worthless. Cal Renteria called me that evening. Cal ran cattle on the east side of the road across from the old man's place, and he had driven past around 3 in the afternoon while Earl was still up there working. He did not say much. He just said he'd seen the new fellow on the burn rock with a strange iron in his hands, and that he had tried to think of a kind way to say what he was thinking, and decided there wasn't one. I asked him what he was thinking. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Randall, that old man is going to work himself to death on ground that never came back and never will. Somebody sold him a bill of goods." I told him I didn't know yet. He said, "Well, I do." And we left it there. But I had watched Earl that morning, and there was something in the way he worked that Cal's phone call could not account for. He had started before first light. I know because I am up before first light most days myself, an old habit that gets in your bones after 50 years of ranching. When I came out to the corral at 5:15, his old pickup was already pulled off on the gravel shoulder below the slope, and I could see the small white cone of a headlamp moving slow across the face of that hill in the dark. Not searching, not wandering, moving in a steady line from one end of a contour to the other, then stepping up maybe 18 inches and beginning again, like he had already mapped the whole face of that slope in his head before he ever set boot on it. He worked through the morning and into the heat of the day. By noon, the temperature had climbed into the mid-80s even in October, which is what the high desert does to you that time of year. Cold at dawn and hot by lunch. He did not stop. He had a gallon water jug staged at the bottom of the slope, and he came down to it maybe once an hour, drank standing up, and went back. He did not eat that I saw. He did not sit down. He drove a hole, dropped something into it from a canvas bag at his hip, pressed the dirt back with the heel of his boot, and moved on. A few feet, another hole, a few feet, another hole. I watched him for 20 minutes before I went on with my day, and I could not place what bothered me about it. At 68 years old, I have watched a lot of men work a lot of bad ground in this valley, and you learn to tell the difference between a man trying something and a man executing something. Earl was executing. He worked until the light went long and red around 6 in the evening. Then he covered his bags with a canvas tarp weighted down with stones and drove away. I stood at my fence post with the last of the coffee gone cold in my cup and looked at the slope. From the road you could see nothing he had done. The ground looked the same as it had looked my whole life. Bald, stony, pale tan, running to pink where the limestone showed through. But that is not what this story is about. That is only what the slope looked like from the road, from Cal Renteria's truck. From any place a man did not trouble himself to look closely. What I had watched that day was an old man doing something on purpose, with the kind of slow certainty you do not come by without paying for it somewhere else first. A brief note for the viewer. The tool Earl was using that morning is called a dibble bar, an iron rod about 3 feet long with a pointed tip and a T-handle, used to punch clean planting holes in hard or rocky ground without disturbing the soil around them. It is one of the oldest planting tools still in use in American agriculture, dating to the early 1800s, and its design has barely changed because it solves a problem nothing else solves as well. On steep, stony slopes where no tractor can climb, it remains the most effective planting tool a person can carry. Part 2. Now here is the part of it that the valley got wrong, and got wrong loudly. About 4 days into his planting, I had a reason to walk down to the south fence line. A strand of barbed wire had gone slack on the corner post we shared, and I had meant to tighten it before the next wind came through and tangled it in the brush. I took my fencing pliers and a few staples and walked the quarter-mile down through the mesquite. I want to be clear that I did not go down to introduce myself. I am not a man who crosses a line just to talk. But the fence needed work, and it ran right past where he was planting. He heard me coming a good 30 feet off. He straightened up from the row he was working and looked at me without any surprise at all, the way a man looks at a thing he has already accounted for. I said good morning. He said it back. His voice was lower than I expected, and steady, with a faint flatness to the vowels. Some old Minnesota in his people that 2 generations of Arizona sun had not quite burned out. I told him I was his neighbor on the bench to the north. He said he knew. I nodded at the holes he was punching and asked him, plain as I could, what he was planting. He said agave. I did not, at that moment, know what to do with that. I knew agave the way every man in that country knew it. The big, spiny century plants that grew wild on the rocky ground, that bloomed once on a tall stalk after 20 or 30 years, and then died. I told him I'd never heard of a man planting the stuff on purpose, that it grew wild for free on every bad slope in the valley, and that the cattle wouldn't touch it. He nodded, slow, the way you nod at a man who has said something polite and expected. Then he asked me a question I have not forgotten. He asked me what I thought the limiting factor would be on that slope. Agave. In this country. I thought about it. I said the heat, probably, and the lack of water, and all that rock. He shook his head just barely. He said the heat was the asset. The lack of water was the asset. The rock was the asset. He said agave did not want good ground. Good ground would rot its heart and kill it. It wanted exactly what that slope was. Poor, dry, stony, alkaline limestone baking in the south sun. The same kind of ground it had grown on for 10,000 years in the high country down in Mexico. He said the thing everybody saw as wrong with that hillside was the very thing that made it perfect. Every other man in the valley had looked at the burn rock and seen what would not grow there. He had come looking for ground that would grow the one thing he was after, and there was not a better 40 acres for it in 3 counties. I picked up my pliers. We talked a few minutes more about the corner post, which he offered to reset himself, and which he did, the next week, better than I would have. And I walked back up to my place with a feeling I did not have a word for yet. I told you there is a difference between a man trying a thing and a man finishing a thing. Standing at that fence, I understood I had been wrong even about that. Earl was not trying to figure out that slope. He had figured it out somewhere else, long before he ever raised his hand at the auction. What I was watching was not a question being asked. It was an answer being completed. Orville Pruitt came up my drive that same afternoon. Orville ran a small spread 3 miles south, and he had borrowed my hydraulic jack the month before and was bringing it back. He stood on my porch with the jack in one hand and his hat in the other, and he looked up at the burn rock, where Earl was now working the 4th or 5th contour row. He said, "Randall, what in the world is that old man doing up there?" I told him, "Planting agave." He looked at me. He said, "Agave." I said, "Yes." He said, "On the burn rock." I said, "Yes." He stood there a long minute. Then he said the thing the whole valley was already saying in private. That somebody had taken advantage of a broke old widower who didn't know any better. That the burn rock had beaten every man who ever touched it, and would beat this one too. That you could no more farm that slope than you could farm the county road. He did not say it with meanness. He said it the way men in that country say a hard truth when they think it needs saying out loud. And I did not argue, because the history of that slope was every bit as bad as he said. But I had stood 30 feet from Earl Lindquist at the fence, and I had heard him say the word agave the way a man says the name of something he has known and studied for a very long time. I watched the slope a while longer after Orville drove off. Earl had moved to the next row, bending, driving, dropping, pressing, moving on, and then he stopped and pulled something out of his jacket pocket and stood up straight a moment to look at it. And I saw that it was a small notebook, a plain composition book, the black and white marbled kind they sell at the feed store for a couple of dollars. But the way he handled it told me it was not new. He opened it to one particular page without hunting for it, read something, closed it, and put it back. He did not write anything down. He was checking the slope against work he had already done somewhere else, in some other season, before he had ever turned the first shovel of soil on that ground. That notebook bothered me more than I let on, not in any wrong way. The way a thing bothers you when you half recognize it but cannot place it. Whatever was guiding Earl across that dead slope, he had not thought of it that morning, or that year. He was finishing work that was already finished in his head, written down in a hand I would later learn was not even his own. And that, I came to understand, made all the difference in the world. A brief note for the viewer. The agave is not a cactus, but a succulent in the asparagus family, and there are well over 200 species, many native to the deserts of the American Southwest and Mexico. The plant stores years of sugar in a swollen central core, called the piña, before sending up a single tall flowering stalk and dying. That slow-built core is what makes certain agave species the base of distilled spirits like tequila and mezcal. The plants thrive precisely where most crops fail. Poor, rocky, alkaline ground in full sun, with very little water. Part 3. Now here is the part of the story I want you to stay with, because this is where I learned what Earl Lindquist had really been doing, and where I understood that what looked from the county road like one old man's foolishness was in truth the most carefully reasoned piece of work I ever saw done on a stretch of Arizona ground in my life. It was about a week after he finished planting, the 3rd week of October. The slope raked smooth and the bulbs all in. I had walked down to the south fence one evening with 2 jars of homemade salsa my daughter had sent me from Tucson, more than I could use. Earl was sitting on the tailgate of his old pickup at the bottom of the slope, drinking water from a mason jar. I held up the salsa over the fence. He came over. We talked a minute, and then he asked me if I wanted to come up to the house and see something. I said I would. His house was a small adobe, a quarter-mile west of the slope. 3 rooms, flat roof, the kind of place that had been somebody's line shack in 1940 and sat empty 15 years before he bought it with the land. He had put a new tin roof on it himself that summer. We sat on the front porch in 2 old wooden chairs facing west toward the Dragoons, and the light was going that deep red the high desert gives you in October, and he set a notebook on the small table between us, not the composition book from his pocket. An older thing, a leather-cornered field ledger, cracked and soft with age, the kind of book that has been carried in a saddlebag for years. He opened it slow. The pages were old, a heavy linen paper gone brown at the edges, and everyone was crowded with a fine slanted hand that was not his. Dates in the margins, columns of figures, soil readings, little pencil drawings of root crowns and flower stalks. Tucked into the cover were photocopies gone slightly waxy with old toner, the kind you get from a coin machine at a county extension office. He laid one flat for me to look at. It was a single page of a bulletin from 1951. The header read University of Arizona Agricultural Experiment Station, Tucson. The bulletin was about the cultivation of native agave on marginal limestone soils in the southeastern part of the state. The author was a man named D.R. Helm. Earl said the name out loud, slow, the way you say a name you have been thinking about for years. He said Helm had been a botanist and a field agronomist at the university from the 1930s until he retired in the 60s. A man who spent most of his career driving the back roads of southern Arizona in a state pickup with a soil auger in the bed, stopping wherever he saw a piece of ground that other people had given up on. Helm had spent years studying the wild agave stands of the borderlands, which slopes grew the plants fastest, which soils built the biggest, sweetest cores, which exposures and elevations the old Mexican mezcaleros had prized for generations. He had written it all down in a string of bulletins almost nobody read. Earl had found a box of them, 15 or 16, at an estate sale on the rodeo grounds outside Douglas in the winter of 1982. He had paid $4 for the whole box. The 1951 bulletin was the one that mattered. What Helm had found, working a wild stand not 5 miles from where Earl's house now stood, was that a south-facing caliche slope over limestone, the exact kind of ground every rancher in the valley wrote off as dead, grew a particular native agave faster and richer than any deep soil ever could. The heat drove the sugar. The lime fed the core. The poor dry rock kept the heart from rotting and forced the plant to build deep. Helm had written that with nothing more than patience and a planting bar, a man could establish a stand of high-sugar agave on burned-out limestone ground that the cattle outfits considered worthless, and harvest mature cores in 7 to 9 years that would rival anything grown in the famous mezcal country south of the border. He had written that in 1951. He had died in 1974. As far as Earl could tell, in all the years between, not one soul in the state of Arizona had ever acted on that bulletin. Not once. Earl had sat with it, he told me, for 2 full winters before he planted a single agave. The first winter he had used it to understand what he was looking at, walking the wild stands, measuring, testing soil in jars on his kitchen table, comparing his own numbers against Helm's across 30 years. Everything matched. The second winter he had stopped testing. He had been waiting until he was sure the conclusion he had drawn was the right one, and not just the one he wanted to be right, because he had nowhere else to go and nothing else left. I told him my own father had done a thing like that once. Walked a piece of low ground on our ranch 3 years before he laid a single drainage tile, and the neighbors all thought he was waiting on money. He wasn't. He was waiting on certainty, which is a different thing and costs more. Earl nodded the way you nod when a man says something plain and true, like doing it any other way would be a carelessness he could not allow. I asked him one more thing that evening. I asked him how he could have been so sure that what he found on the slope would match what a dead man had written 30 years before. And he said a thing I have turned over many nights since. He said he had not been sure. He said you cannot be sure of a thing like that. What you can be is prepared to be wrong about it in a small enough way that you can recover. 500 plants, he said, was the size of a mistake he could afford to make. If the slope was not what he believed it to be, he would lose a couple of years and the cost of the starts and walk away knowing more about that ground than any living man. That was the deal he had made with himself in the second winter, alone in that adobe with the wind coming through the roof. And it was the deal he honored the morning he drove the first stake. A brief note for the viewer. The field agronomists and botanists of the mid-20th century left behind a great body of careful handwritten knowledge. Local soil studies, plant trials, growing notes. Much of it published only in short mimeographed bulletins mailed out by state universities and rarely archived. These men often retired or died before farmers acted on their findings. A significant part of that knowledge survives today only in unbound copies scattered through county offices, estate sales, and old farm libraries, and much of it has never been digitized. Part 4. The agave did almost nothing for the first 2 years, the way Earl had told me to expect. From my fence line, the slope looked the same as ever. Bald and stony, the little starts so low and gray-green against the rock that you could not see them at all from the road. The valley mostly forgot about him. Cal Renteria still shook his head when he drove past, but Earl walked that slope every week, in the cool of the morning, checking, weeding by hand, replacing the few starts that had not taken, and writing in his composition book in his own small, even hand. By the 3rd year you could see them. By the 4th, the slope that had grown nothing in living memory was covered in row on row of blue-gray agave, each plant grown to the size of a bushel basket, their spined leaves catching the morning light so the whole hillside seemed to shimmer when the wind moved across it. I stood at my fence and looked at it a long time. Cal drove out, parked on the shoulder, looked at it, and did not say one word, and drove home. But agave does not pay in the 4th year. Agave makes you wait, and Earl waited. He had planted for the long harvest, the mature cores, and those would not be ready until the 7th year and after. He spent those years the way he spent everything, carefully. He thinned and tended. He let the strongest plants throw their pups, the small clones that come up around the base. And he dug those and planted them out across new ground. So the original 500 slowly became 1,000, then closer to 2. He kept his notebooks. He kept the leather ledger on the kitchen table where he could reach it. It was in the 7th year that the thing turned. And it turned the way these things do. Slow, and then all at once. Earl harvested his first mature cores that spring. Cut the great spined leaves away with a sharpened bar the old mezcaleros call a coa. And trimmed the heavy pale piñas out of the ground, and split one open on his porch to see what 7 years had built. The core was dense and dripping and sweet clear through. He sent a piece of it and a written record of his soil and his methods to a small agricultural lab because he wanted to know what he had. The man from the lab called him on the telephone before the written report ever reached the mailbox. The sugar content of Earl's agave, grown on that burned-out limestone slope, was among the highest the lab had ever measured from a domestic American sample. Higher, the man said, than a good deal of what came up from the famous agave country to the south. He asked Earl where it had been grown. Earl told him, a hillside outside town that the cattle wouldn't climb. He asked if it could be done again. Earl said it could. The first one to drive out was a man who ran a small craft distillery down near the border, making mezcal in the old way in copper stills. He had heard about Earl's cores from the lab. He drove 3 hours and 40 minutes. He said the number twice, the way people say a distance when they want you to know how seriously they are taking a thing. And he stood on Earl's slope and split a piña with his own knife and tasted the raw sweet flesh and stood there a long moment without saying a word. What he said when he finally spoke was not how much does it cost. It was how much do you have? Then came a distiller from up near Tucson who drove down for it. Then 2 more from across the line in New Mexico. Then a man from a craft outfit clear over in West Texas who had read about Earl's agave in a small regional spirits magazine and drove the better part of a day to see the slope with his own eyes. They drove hours, all of them, past 1,000 bad hillsides, to buy off the one slope every man in the valley had sworn was dead. Earl did not raise his prices on them. He did not expand past what one old man could tend and cut and haul with care. He sold his cores to a short list of small distillers in 3 states, and he had a waiting list, and he never once put a sign on the county road. The men who had laughed at the auction did not laugh anymore. Some of them came around hat in hand to ask how he had done it, and Earl told them every time, plainly, because he said that telling was a part of the work too. He told them about DR. Helm, and the $4 box of bulletins, and the dead man's bulletin nobody in the state had ever acted on. He never once let a man believe he had done it alone. He is older now. The gray blonde has gone fully white. He still walks the slope in the cool of the morning. He still uses the same dibble bar he started with, the iron worn smooth by his hands over 7 years of planting. He has had the brittle pages of Helm's ledger copied and bound so the old man's hand will not be lost, and the original he keeps in a wooden box on his kitchen table, beside a photograph his late wife once took of him standing in front of the first calf he ever raised. And on the windowsill above his kitchen sink, where the late afternoon sun comes through, there is a single glass jar. It is small, no bigger than a baby food jar, and it is half full of dry pale dirt, caliche and crushed limestone, scraped off the burn rock the first week he owned it, before he drove a single hole. On the front, in his own hand in black marker, is a small label. It reads, Burn Rock, Cochise County, Arizona, October 1985. He showed it to me once. I asked him why a man would keep a jar of the very dirt everybody told him was dead. He turned it in the light a while. Then he said the rock was never the enemy. The rock, he said, was the whole reason. It was the poor dry limestone that grew the sweetest cores, and it was that same poor rock that scared every other man off the slope and left it cheap enough for a broke old widower to buy. Everybody looked at this hill, he said, and saw what wouldn't grow. One dead man looked at the same hill and saw what would. He set the jar back on the sill. The land doesn't owe you a crop, he said. It owes you the truth of what was always there, if you're willing to wait long enough and pay enough to see it. A brief note for the viewer. The cultivation of agave for distilling has begun in recent years. to take quiet root in the American Southwest. Growers in southern Arizona, New Mexico, and West Texas have found that the region's hot, dry, alkaline limestone slopes, long considered worthless for conventional farming, can produce agave cores of unusually high sugar content, well suited to small batch mezcal and agave spirits. The model favors patient, small-scale operations on marginal land and has begun to draw interest from retired ranchers and second-career farmers across the borderlands.